by my late 20s, I'd amassed a small fortune. And it was then that I decided that I would move to South America to earn even more money and get involved in smuggling cocaine. So I jumped out of the frying pan into a great big fire.
So you're touching like a very dangerous world in
dangerous
in South
commodity,
America.
dealing with dangerous people, where the commodity shifted, and so did all the consequences that went with that. So the money, the prison sentence, life, death. In the cannabis world, it was kind of romantic. There was no danger in it. The sentencing was low, but when you got into the world of cocaine smuggling, it was a whole different world.
Nick Brewer. Nick's journey is completely unique. That involves sport, immersion in the drug smuggling world, prison, and finally liberation. You could totally make a Hollywood movie out of it. Nick spent years in an Argentinian prison in an ultra-violent environment where he finally discovered yoga and freedom. Join us as we uncover the insights, the challenges, and the triumphs that have shaped Nick's journey and the profound impact of Primal Moves on his life and on those around him.
So basically, in the prisons in South America, you have to hang out in gangs, and the bigger your gang, the better. If you're on your own, you're going to get killed, or probably gang raped. The death rate in the prisons are really high. They're very violent, very poor. The prisoners are those that come from the slums. They're rejects of society. They've never been loved as children. By the age of 20, they're serving life sentences for murder.
Do you have a pivotal moment where you really realize that you managed to kill your ego and to heal?
4 years into my sentence, I think I was 2 years or 2.5 years into isolation, I had a complete nervous breakdown.
Hello and welcome to Kaplankaya on the southwestern Aegean coast of Turkey. We are recording the podcast, the Harvest series, where we interview amazing speakers, practitioners and artists joining the Harvest Summit. I hope you will enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the Harvest Series podcast. Today we are in Kaplankaya and our guest is Nick Brewer. Nick's journey is completely unique. It's very difficult not to be moved by his story that involves sport, immersion in the drug smuggling world, prison, and finally liberation. You could totally make a Hollywood movie out of it. Nick spent years in an Argentinian prison in an ultra-violent environment where he finally discovered yoga and freedom. Now Nick shares the transformative method he created with thousands in Ibiza. Join us as we uncover the insights, the challenges and the triumphs that have shaped Nick's journey and the profound impact of Primal Moves on his life and on those around him. Hello, Nick.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much for being here. As I said, I was very moved by your talk today and all the wisdom you gained from what happened to you. So let's talk about this. To start, I'd like to know how you got access to yoga books in prison in Argentina, and how they influenced your life when you had never been exposed to this world before.
So the one benefit that we were allowed in prison were books. And my parents, I asked them just to go and find me any yoga book that they could. I said, go to the bookshop, put your hand up on the shelf, and the book that you find is going to be the book that I need. And just keep on doing that.
Okay.
And so they managed to send me in books every week, which I studied meticulously. And it was the books on yoga that became my teacher.
Okay. Could you come back take us back to the context of that period? You were in Buenos Aires at the time, in an extremely dangerous prison, and isolation, although hard, was almost a blessing for you.
It was a total blessing. It was a blessing and a curse. You would never choose to go into 4 years of isolation. But at the same time, it was where all my growth came from. It was like an accelerated growth. And it was around 20, 22 hours a day on my own. There was 2 to 3 hours a day that I was out of my room, of my cell.
So what happened to you? Can you tell us your journey and what happened? What led you to this prison in Argentina?
So if I go back to my teenage years, I was a pro skier. And I was skiing for the UK team, living in Méribel in France. I had sponsorships and scholarships, and I was on the national or the international FIS circuit. And I was 18 years of age in a training accident, and I broke my back in 2 places.
Wow.
So literally in 2 seconds, my skiing career was over. The doctor said,
How old were you?
18.
18. Okay.
No, I'd just been training for 8 years. So I didn't really have much of an academic education. My entire life and dream was to be that of a skier, a pro skier, and then maybe have my own ski school. So my dreams were taken away in one day, one afternoon. It was finished, it was over. So I went into a very deep, dark depression. And I had a bit of a collapse of my first identity of being a skier. And with my depression, I wanted to be anonymous. I wanted to disappear and self-destruct. So I went to the south of France and I found this beautiful little town called Antibes. And in the harbour there was a beach. And I slept on there for 8 months.
Wow.
Like a vagabond. I lived out the bins with the tramps, became anonymous. I grew dreadlocks and smoked lots of weed.
How did I'm wondering about how it happened, because you had a family, and so you were alone. So you didn't tell to anybody. You were there. You
No,
were
I mean, I went
depressed, like...
after my injury, and I got out of hospital. I went home, but I felt like a failure. I had shame, and there was this sense of I had failed my parents because they had supported me. They didn't have many resources, and they had supported me the best they could over the past 4 or 5 years. So when I broke my back and I got dropped from the team, there was a sense of I failed. And so they were then asking me to go and get a job in an office, which to me was the worst thing that could ever have happened. And I was tired of listening to people saying, oh, it's such a shame that you broke your back. And I wanted to be anonymous. So I kind of ran away.
Wow, okay. So you didn't tell anyone?
No, I told them. I said, I'm going to go to the south of France.
Okay. And you didn't give any news, or...?
No, I kind of disappeared.
Wow. And so people came to you, so you were a bit like in the sleeping on the beach?
I was on the beach and I got introduced to drugs, money and women. And I started selling drugs when I was 19.
Wow. So cannabis at the beginning?
Yeah, cannabis, ecstasy pills. I mean, I was a bum.
How did you feel at the time when you were selling drugs?
So what happened was, I lived a life that was full of adrenaline and addictions. And when I broke my back, I went into this void, this numbness. And so it was the drugs that refueled my fire. It kind of created an addiction that was numbing out the pain from skiing.
Okay.
And after a year of being in the south of France, I went to the south of Spain, to Marbella.
Okay.
Where I hooked up with some families that were from the underworld in London. And that's then when I got into smuggling.
Okay. Smuggling...
cannabis from Morocco.
Cannabis, okay.
Yeah, so we were sending it home in trucks from southern Spain into the UK. This was in very early 90s.
Okay, and then you had some... you made some money? You had like...
I made a lot of money.
Wow.
I mean, I bought my first house when I was 24. I became successful. I got into smuggling. I became good at it. I became respected. And by my late 20s, I had amassed a small fortune. And it was then that I decided that I would move to South America to earn even more money and get involved in smuggling cocaine. So I jumped out of the frying pan into a great big fire.
Wow. So you're touching like a very dangerous world in
dangerous
in South
commodity,
America.
dealing with dangerous people, where the commodity shifted, and so did all the consequences that went with that. So the money, the prison sentence, life, death. In the cannabis world, it was kind of romantic. There was no danger in it. The sentencing was low, but when you got into the world of cocaine smuggling, it was a whole different world. Then you're dealing with Colombians, you're dealing with not hundreds of thousands, but millions of euros. So everything shifted.
Okay. How did you avoid to be killed in being like a British in Argentina and the cocaine world?
I mean, that's a good question. I was, for a young kid in my late 20s, early 30s, I was a little bit ahead of the game in what I was doing. And I was extremely conscious about surveillance and where I lived and how I worked and who I worked with. But I was protected because I was around a lot of Colombians and I had a lot of infrastructure around me. So we went to Argentina purely with the intent, a premeditated intent, to smuggle cocaine. I didn't arrive in Argentina by coincidence. I went there to do that.
Yeah. What was your day-to-day life?
So I had two lives. I had the life of the cocaine smuggler, and I had the life of the British entrepreneur that was invested in properties and building businesses. So I had two completely separate lives. So the life that I lived in Buenos Aires amongst the local people was that of a businessman. I built a nightclub, restaurants, I was building houses. So they just assumed that I was a very wealthy, young British entrepreneur.
Okay.
For the other side, I was a cocaine smuggler, which was a completely separate world that I kept separate. But I was very good at it and very successful. And I was sending home around £10 million worth of cocaine at a time in containers. So I was into container shipping.
Okay. How were you sleeping at night?
I slept really well.
Okay, so you were...
I mean, after 10 years of smuggling, getting arrested was almost like a hazards of the job. It wasn't something... I mean, I didn't really suffer from any kind of fear-based trauma when I was working. I was extremely arrogant. I had a huge ego that justified my very existence. So getting caught wasn't something which really played on me too much. And I thought that in my arrogance, because I was in South America, if I got caught, I'd just pay my way out of it. Even as dangerous as it was, because there was a lot of weapons, a lot of guns. But equally, you know, it had become my reality. And it's very interesting because the human mind is very adaptable and your reality can shift very quickly. And that can become your new normal.
Wow.
And smuggling became my new normal. You know, I thought it was okay to smuggle £10 million worth of cocaine, drive around an Aston Martin with a gun. And if needs be, I'd get into a gunfight.
Yeah, wow.
It was my normal. That's how crazy and how deluded we can get.
When you talk about yourself, it looks like you're talking about another Nick. It was another person for you.
Because I've completely transcended that old Nick. He doesn't exist anymore. There's a part of his character and his personality that are still there. Obviously, it's still the same person, but that side of him is gone. Wow. That flame went out in prison. I completely rehabilitated myself in prison. I transcended my entire old self and my past.
So how did you get arrested? How did you get caught?
I was under observation from Secret Services.
By the
British, South American, Central American. There were many agencies that were looking at me and my group for about 3 or 4 years. And they were trying to catch us for quite a few years.
Okay. And one day?
And then one day they had cameras in my warehouses and houses, and they were just waiting for me to receive a shipment, because we used to receive quite big shipments in lorries. And I remember we had a huge party in my nightclub in Buenos Aires. It was one of the most high-profile nightclubs, called Dorrego, in Palermo, in Buenos Aires. It was a very beautiful club. And I walked out of there at 5 o'clock in the morning because I was flying to Colombia the next day to do a deal. And I got ambushed because I just received delivery of, I think it was 200 or 300 kilos of cocaine out of 1,500. So the cocaine would come down in shipments until we had enough to send home.
Wow. So it was very violent arrest.
Yeah, I got beat up. I was driven into the tunnels of Palermo, and 4 guys jumped out wearing black boiler suits, balaclavas, and they had machine guns and pump action shotguns. And they dragged me out of the car. They tied my arms and legs together. They pinned my kneecap on the curb and tried to break it. And they basically beat the shit out of me. Wow. I was then taken to the downtown drug squad headquarters and beaten up again. You have to understand that I was an Englishman from a country where there's social security and economic opportunity. And I was in a kind of second world country where there was no social security and no economic opportunity. So for them to catch someone like me was the prize. An Englishman in Argentina.
Wow. So you were punished in the prison?
I was punished.
Can you share what happened? What was your life there?
It was hard. I mean, South American prisons aren't the same as Western prisons as we know it, or American prisons, which are relatively safe. They have a different kind of structure to them. And the chances of dying are quite slim. Whereas in a South American prison, it's very poor. It's very corrupt, and they're like cities behind walls where everything happens: drugs, weapons, prostitution.
Because women
Women get brought in.
can come in. Okay.
Women can come in as visitors or as prostitutes. There's money, there's trade. They're basically like a functioning city that runs under corruption, and they're really dark places. The guards, the governors of the prisons are corrupt, the police are corrupt, the whole system's completely corrupt. The judges that run the cases, the lawyers try to keep you in prison longer than they can to get money out of you. If you've got a high profile enough case, the judges and the prosecutors will try and bribe you for money,
Okay.
which are never honoured, by the way.
And as an Englishman, people would look at you more.
Of course, I mean, I was like a gringo. So I was an English narco, which was like a drug smuggler. And the smugglers had money. But I was quite lucky in one sense. I was looked after by Colombians. So basically, in the prisons in South America, you have to hang out in gangs. And the bigger your gang, the better. If you're on your own, you're going to get killed. Or probably gang raped. Because the death rate in the prisons are really high. There's very violent, very poor. The prisoners are those that come from the slums. They're rejects of society. They've never been loved as children. And by the age of 20, they're serving life sentences for murder. But they never knew love. They were beaten up as children. They were just kids from the slum. And so when you're confronted with 2,000 kids from the slum that are serving life sentences, it's quite a... You really do start to understand how low and how dark the human condition can go. And you're also living in a prison where you're repressed by a system that's so dark that for many prisoners, death was a happier option.
Oh gosh, all right.
So if they weren't killing each other, they'd kill themselves. I mean, sometimes there was a fight. There could be 6, 7, 8 people dying in one fight from machetes.
Wow, so
Really violent,
ultra
brutal
violent. Okay,
deaths.
so you're scared to death when you arrive here.
It's terrible, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the first year I was in the slum of the prison was very hard. And then after the first year, I got put into isolation.
But these people, these Colombians who protect you, why do they protect you?
Because they were narcos. So the Colombians are smugglers. So the smugglers stick together.
Okay.
So you had the armed
it's
robbers.
Like little families.
It's
okay.
group. You have the armed robbers, you have the murderers, and you have the narcos.
Okay.
And then you have the petty thieves, the rapists,
Okay, wow.
and they suffer. So there's kind of gangland wars inside the prison. But as I say, I was with Colombians, so I was protected. Even though you still had to fight for your life sometimes, most of the time I was protected. But equally, the judges, they thought I was going to get kidnapped inside the prison and tortured for money. Now, one thing they couldn't have was a British citizen with a case as high profile as mine, kidnapped. So they put me into isolation, into a secure unit.
But they will kidnap and put you out of prison?
No,
Inside?
they kidnap you in the prison.
Okay, but where do they put you? Okay.
They just start torturing you. They start cutting off your fingers.
Sure. Okay. Ah, wow, okay.
Yeah. They'll torture you inside the prison, and the guards are involved as well. So then they'll start calling your judge or your family and telling you to pay for your freedom outside. Freedom from kidnap inside the prison.
Okay.
And this is all controlled by the police. Yeah, you have to understand, it's a place that suffers from generations of institutionalized corruption.
Okay, so that's where isolation came as a blessing.
It was a blessing.
Yeah.
And it's also where change happened. So the first 6 months of isolation that I did, as I said, I went into this isolation unit with a book on yoga. And this created my first shift.
So why yoga? How did this book of yoga happen to you?
So one of my co-defendants was walking down the wing one day, and he wanted to buy his girlfriend a present. So he asked a friend of his to go and buy a present for his girlfriend. This friend sent the present to my friend in the prison. And on the day that he received the present, he's walking down the wing, and I saw him, and I said, "What are you holding in your hand?" And he says, "A book." I said, "What kind of book? You can't read." He said, "It's a book on yoga. It's for my present. It's for my girlfriend." And I laughed at him. And then when I went into isolation, I took his book. And this created my first shift.
Wow.
It was almost like a gift from God. Like how that book managed to work its way from the outside into the prison, into my hand,
Yeah.
and help me into isolation. So I looked at it as a gift.
Wow. So what called you in this book? Was it the physical aspects or meditation?
Something just resonated with me. The book had lots of pictures of these things called asanas, which 20 years ago I had no idea what asanas were, but they were physical positions. So you have to remember that I came from a physical background. I was a pro skier.
That's what's interesting.
So I had a foundation of training in my life. So when I saw the pictures on the book, I started to copy the pictures and started to read the text. And it spoke about the mind and the ego and meditation and breath work and self-study and self-inquiry. So I dug deep into the book and tried to understand what was going on. I mean, this was my first ever understanding that we even had a mind or an ego. My mind was so far in Mars, I didn't even know we had one. So when it spoke about observing the mind, when I first started to look into my mind and observe it, I realized it was a total zoo. It was chaos up there.
Wow. So do you think because you've been an athlete, so you had this accident, but in a way you've been saved because you were an athlete, you know your body, and you were trained and you know how to control your body in a way?
Yeah, I was a trained athlete, so what that did, that gave me discipline.
Yeah.
I started training at the age of 13. So that gave me a foundation and a blueprint of discipline. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we can train or practice through motivation, and sometimes we can train through discipline. I was lucky enough to have discipline, as well as I was motivated to train. So for me to start a practice was quite easy. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. I started to turn my prison life into a practice that I got from the book. So from the books that I was getting, I started to create daily practices where I'd wake up in the morning and I'd do breath work, pranayama, asanas, physical movements, self-study, self-inquiry, repeat.
Wow.
And I would do this 3 times a day, every single day.
And after how many times did you start to be hooked and to have the real benefits?
It was a slow process.
Okay.
It was a long, slow process of recovery, of rehabilitation, of me understanding myself, understanding my coping mechanisms, understanding the story that I'd written my entire life around rejection and abandonment, because I was put into a children's home as a baby and I was adopted. So my mother had put me into an orphanage as a baby. So this created a hard wiring, like a blueprint around abandonment and not being good enough, even though I was adopted by really beautiful parents.
Okay. You had this wound inside you.
I still had that wound inside me, which created deep conflict and destruction inside me. So then when I broke my back skiing, it was more rejection and more abandonment. So that's why I hit the self-destruct switch.
Okay.
So when I arrived to prison, I had all this trauma. But it was yoga that saved me, and the practices and embodying the process of practice, which then made me break down all the coping mechanisms, all the identities that I had, so that I could then start to heal myself through love, forgiveness, and repetition.
Wow. And you did that on your own?
On my own, in isolation. And it was hard.
Wow.
It wasn't easy. Some days, I went into deep depression. When I got out of my first 6 months isolation, I paid my way to go into a VIP wing in the prison called Papillon 50. It was a famous wing where there were 20 prisoners in the entire prison of 2,000, and it was like a secure unit. It was still poor, but the prisoners were kind of high-profile narcos, murderers, officials like politicians or judges, commissioners of police, so you could survive. And it was in the private wing, the VIP wing, that I managed to hassle or find my way into another isolation unit, which was upstairs. It was 2 meters by 3 meters, and I went into this one for 4 years.
Okay.
So I was then spending 22 hours a day in isolation, but I then did a stint of 4 years, which was where I really dug deep into practice, and that is where all the shifts occurred.
Do you have a pivotal moment where you really realize that you managed to kill your ego and to heal?
There was no pivotal moment or light bulb moments, but 4 years into my sentence, I think I was 2 years or 2.5 years into isolation, I had a complete nervous breakdown. So one day I'm standing in my cell and I fell on the floor. All the energy was drained from my body and I collapsed on the floor. And I had a total physical, mental and emotional breakdown. And I started crying like a baby. And I sobbed and shook like a baby for days. And there was no one there to come and get me. There was no social services. There was no humanity or friends to come see that I was okay. I just basically cried myself out of this trauma. And the first words that I heard were, "You're going to be just okay as you are." And with that thread of light, I climbed my way out of that hole. And then I started to enter into quite euphoric states of happiness. I became desirelessness. So I had no desire. I had no desire for freedom, for sex, for money, for material things. I was in a state of being.
Okay.
I lost all my attachments.
Was it nice?
Yeah, I mean, I was euphorically happy. And then I think I was going into year 4, heading towards year 5. And I had probably like my first ever, I call it like a spiritual experience. I'm lying down on the floor and I started to have this pain-pleasure sensation coming out of the base of my spine that started to emanate in waves through my body. And it was almost as if someone put ecstasy pills in the base of my spine. And I started to have these almost like full-body cellular orgasms. And as I opened my eyes, I was seeing psychedelic colours. So this was the first experience I had. It was after this that I went into these blissful states. So I was kind of becoming free from the constructs of my mind. I'd broken down all the identities. I started to have ego deaths. Even though we keep recreating, the ego was dying.
Okay.
And that was then when I went into a really amazing space of being. And this went on for another 2 years.
So now that you kill your ego, what happens? How many? So you stay 2 more years?
I was 6 years in total.
Okay. And how are you liberated? So what's happening?
So in the end, the judge, my sentencing judge, I got sentenced after 4 years. So I didn't actually go to court for 4 years. So they broke all my humanitarian rights as well, because you should actually be sentenced anywhere in the world within 2 years. So anyway, I went to court for 4 years and got sentenced to 10 years, which didn't really matter by that time anyway. But 6 years in, I was having problems with the Argentine Secret Service, and they were trying to bribe me for money. So they said to me that I needed to give them $1 million each or they're going to kill me.
Okay.
So I didn't really know what to do at the time. I had no more money left anyway. So I humoured them, but they kept on coming back and threatening me, saying that they were going to move me to the north of Argentina where I would die. So in the end, I called my judge and I said to him, "Look, I've got some problems here with the Secret Service." And he said to me, "Yes, I know. We've been waiting for you to call us because we're blocked from getting in touch with you." So he said, "You need to call your embassy as well." So I called the British embassy. The judge sent out an armoured truck to the prison and they took me to the courthouse and he asked me to explain what was going on. So I said, "Well, I have these 2 guys that come to the prison. They're dressed in blue shirts, so blue suits and white shirts and wear ties, and they keep telling me that they're the Secret Service." And he showed me a picture of 2 guys. And I said, "Yeah, that's them." And he said, "Well, they are the Secret Service and they could kill you." So I said, "So what do we do then?" So he said, "Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign an order saying that you can't leave your cell and I'm going to expel you with the embassy. So we're going to do your paperwork to expel you from the country because that's the safest place for you." And I'd served, I think, more than 60% of my sentence. So they said, "We're going to give you the rest in good behaviour." So I went back to the prison and stayed in isolation. And then not long after, the guard came to my room with a green piece of paper and he said to me, "You're being expelled. You've got 5 minutes to go." So they came with an armoured truck to my wing and they literally put me in the back of an armoured truck and drove me to the airport and put me on the back of a BA jet.
How do you feel?
Well, this is my first ever experience of freedom, was sitting on the back of a BA jet with 300 tourists. So as you can imagine, I've just been in this nut house of a prison for 6 years where people are killing each other for fun, and now I'm sitting on the back of a plane with 300 people. So that in itself was quite an experience. But I did notice that there was, I was just sitting there being, and I noticed that everyone around me was doing. They were playing with their in-house entertainment, they were munching, they were eating junk foods, they were playing on these new phones that had Facebook, they had like 4G or 3G. Everything had changed, tech had really moved forwards in those years. And I just sat there observing on the plane for 12 hours. And as I was on the plane, it was like a time warp. And my entire life just went poof, and it evaporated, it dissolved, it diluted, it just disappeared. And prison was gone. All the darkness, the last 20 years of my life just evaporated.
Really? Wow.
It's just dissolved. And it wasn't tangible anymore, it wasn't accessible, it was gone. All the darkness was left behind in Devosso. And I arrived at Heathrow Terminal 5 the next day, which was a brand new terminal at the time, and I was sitting down having a coffee. I had $80 in my back pocket, which was enough money for a phone call and the train fare home. And I was wondering what the fuck I was going to do with myself. Because obviously when I went into prison, I had enough money to last me for the rest of my life. And now I had enough money to get home. And as I was sitting there, I downloaded some reflections, and it was that movement and meditative practices had had such a profound impact on my life that it had set me free from the confines of my mind and prison. And that if I could facilitate these practices into one person's life, then everything I'd gone through would be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been my mission for the last 14 years.
Wow. What's the first thing you did when you arrived in the UK? Who was the first person you wanted to see?
I went home to see my mum and dad and had a cup of tea.
As a British would do.
That was it.
Okay.
Very quiet. There was no parties. I mean, the thing was, when I got out of prison, nothing really changed. I didn't feel all of a sudden I'm free.
Okay. Because you were already free in your mind?
Exactly.
Okay.
I freed myself up 2 years ago. So the only thing that shifted was the geographics. But there wasn't like, oh, I'm out of prison, I'm free. Wow, that's amazing. Let's go and party. Or, the old Nick was dead.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need to go out and drug myself. I didn't need women. I didn't need to do anything. I didn't need to go anywhere. I was just happy to go home and sit down, have a cup of tea, and sit with my mum and dad.
Now that you had healed, how had your relationship changed with your parents on the way you saw them?
Well, that's amazing. I mean, obviously, when I went into prison, I had a really unhealthy relationship towards myself. So the relationship I had to the external world was super unhealthy, with my parents, with women, with my friends. So once I healed the relationship with myself, the relationship with everyone around me changed, including my parents.
Okay.
And they were amazing.
And your father is a policeman?
He was a policeman.
Yeah.
And he taught me all about non-judgment and unconditional love, because he never said a word to me.
What a man.
An amazing man. Really quite an amazing man. Such a great teacher.
So how did you manage as a former prisoner to get clients?
So 3 months later, I took about 3 months to kind of settle back in and just have some home time. And I went to visit some friends in Notting Hill Gate in West London. And there was an apartment for rent, and I had no money. So my friends got together and they loaned me some money so I could rent an apartment. But I had no furniture, so they rented me this apartment, but I had no furniture. And I was hanging out in Portobello Road. So all the barrel boys with the fruit and veg would give me food, and I used to go to a cafe, an Italian deli. And one day I was sitting in a deli and the guy came up to me and he was Italian. It was very funky, quite quirky, and he asked me what I did for a living. And I said to him, I'm a yoga teacher. And he said, I know some clients that are looking for a yoga teacher. He said, where do you teach? So I said, in my studio. He said, amazing. So he introduced me to a really lovely French lady, client number one. And she came up to my apartment, which is where I lived, but also my studio. It was basically a one-bedroom apartment, and the front room was a really beautiful old square Georgian room with wooden floors and sash windows, but no furniture because I had no money. And she walked into my apartment and she saw the bed and then no furniture. And she said to me, do you live here? So I said, yeah. And she was so happy. She thought, wow, I found myself a monk in London. But little did she know that I just come out of prison and I had no money. I couldn't buy any furniture. So she became my client number one.
Wow.
And she introduced me to her friends. And within, I think, about a year, I was doing 100 sessions a month.
Okay, wow. So you had a very powerful teaching, I guess.
Yeah, and I was using my experiences from prison. So I built a network and a community in West London. But at the same time, as I started to earn money, I started to travel east. And I was going to India and Thailand, and I was practicing with two amazing teachers. One is Paul Daligan, and his teacher, Sri Opi Tiwari who lives in Pune, India. So I used to go to their ashrams and study asanas, pranayama, philosophy, and I did that for about 8 years. So they retaught me everything that I kind of looked at and learnt in prison, but it was very uncompartmentalized.
Yeah. Okay.
So they put everything in order and they taught me verbally everything I know. So I studied with them for 8 years, and I studied like elementary gymnastics, Pilates, many modalities of movement. And so with my training in all these modalities of movement and yoga, my experiences, I put together a functional system of movement, which I now call Primal Moves, which is basically a refinement of all my learnings.
Okay, can you explain about Primal Move? So first, the name. What is Primal Move?
So Primal is primal. I mean, I'm primal. Primal was born, not the name, but when I was in prison, it was very primal. It was very raw. It was very basic. I was living in a concrete cell. I was in isolation. It was hard. It was raw. And so, what came out of there was very primal. It was very basic.
Okay, almost like survival.
Survival, okay. Yeah. And Primal Moves is a method of movement. Firstly, it's a very functional system that the byproduct is you're going to get extremely fit and strong. It's body weight movement, floor-based and flow. But the idea is that it drops people into their bodies and gets them out of their heads. Mm-hmm. Because when I was in prison, I realized that living in my head was a very painful place to live. So through practice, I was able to live in my body, and I realized that was a very pleasurable place to be. So the idea was that I would facilitate this practice into people's lives and try and drop them out of their heads and get them in their bodies so they become embodied and they could feel instead of think.
Who come to see you? Is it like a lot of probably broken people or people who want to heal, who are attracted?
The community is very diverse. It's very eclectic. So we have the all-year-round community in Ibiza, which is where I live. And then there's a whole array of people that come from all over the world, from all around Europe, the Americas, East and West Coast. And also I deal with a lot of addicts and alcoholics and people that are depressed. They're just drawn to me. Okay. I think from my experiences, I'm able to help them.
And you know how to talk to them, I guess.
By empowering them through practice, and they can relate to me, the suffering. So that's really helped them to move forwards. But we now have, in Ibiza, we have my foot flow in the studio is 12,000 a year. We have 12,000 people a year coming to train at the space. So it's amazing. So it's a very community-driven brand. And it was through the community growing so much that there was a demand for me to open studios in other cities. I mean, I was just quite happy living in Ibiza, coaching there, because there was such a beautiful demand from the community in other cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, Milan, New York, California, LA, Miami. I was then inspired to raise money to expand. So 6 months ago, I opened my second studio in Barcelona. I'm now building one in Lisbon, and I'm negotiating some deals with some local people in Madrid and Amsterdam.
Okay. Wow.
So the idea is to open studios in the cities that will feed the community.
Okay. What would you say to people who still have a fear of rejection? What's your advice?
So they need to rewrite the story and understand they're not being rejected. That's just their experience. And they need to do the work on loving themselves, forgiving themselves, and knowing that they're okay as they are. Because when they're getting rejected, the person that's rejecting them is just having their own experience. But because there's a trauma or wounding around rejection, the abandoned will always feel rejected, which is a triggering reactive emotion. So you need to sit with that feeling and understand that, hey, I'm not being rejected or abandoned. I just wrote a story around that. I've got a hard wiring that I created around being rejected. And you can rewrite that story through practice.
Do you have remorse for your life when you were smuggling?
I mean, obviously, I realized that I was feeding the consumerist society with cocaine, and there was a lot of negative effects from that. And I reaped the repercussions of that in prison because I was faced with the flip side of the drug trade, which was the poor side in South America in prison. So I suffered a lot. and had to do a lot of work on myself, a lot of forgiveness, which is why now I know that when I'm coaching, it's almost like the deal that I have. It's like I walk a double-edged sword. I can coach and help people and teach, but that's it. Life won't allow me to do anything else. Because whenever I've tried in the past to get off coaching or teaching, all the doors slammed in my face. Okay. When I went back to coaching, all the doors opened. So I know that I walk a double-edged sword. I have to give back.
Yeah. It's not always that we have some happy endings after prison. You came out of prison bigger, wiser. Do you think sometimes of a program that could help prisoners, like to spread this and to all prisoners or the one who want to heal at least?
Sure. I mean, I make up about 1% of the prison population, even less, probably 0.5% of the prison population, because the prison system the world over is a failed system. It doesn't work. Maybe in some forward-thinking countries like Scandinavia, Holland, they have programs. The rest of the prisons say they have programs in place, but what they're doing is actually stripping prisoners of their dignity by making them feel worse than what they already feel, by not re-educating them, by not working on rehabilitation and understanding why they're there. It's almost like they just lock them up and throw the key away, and they give them criminal records, which means they can never get jobs. They don't work on their identities. They don't look at their past traumas in life, that they may have come from abused families or addictive, alcoholic, abusive families. So the system just does not work, which is why there's a 98% return rate in prisons. And yes, they do need programs put in place. But the prison system is, the thought of a prison system teaching yoga, where yoga is quite elitist. The governments just couldn't handle the stress of thinking our prisoners are doing yoga when they should be being punished, when actually what most prisoners need is help.
Yeah. And not even thinking about healing.
It doesn't even come on the radar.
Yeah.
Which is why it costs the taxpayer billions.
Yeah. What are the lessons, the key lessons, and the message you want to say?
So I think this is a beautiful story because Primal Moves is a product of practice. Very simple. It came from practice. So I think that, I try to inspire people to have a daily practice and dig deep into that practice because it will show you an awful lot about yourself. And with the practice, you need to stick at it and dig that hole so deep that you become very bored of doing that practice. Then you need to fall in love with boredom. And that's then when the practice is going to start showing you all the character defects that you have, the good side of you, the bad side, but you've got to dig deep into that practice. Wow. And that's where healing and growth can come from.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Nick?
No, I think we've shared enough.
And because the theme of Harvest this year is radical connection, today, when do you feel radically connected?
I think this morning when I was delivering my keynote talk, and it was the first time I actually spoke publicly in front of 200 or 300 people, and it was an amazing feeling. I felt so supported and connected to everyone that was listening, so I could really go deep and share all my deepest fears and feelings about what's happened in my life. So I was really grateful to Harvest for giving me that platform to share my life.
Wow, wonderful. Are you, sorry for this last question, but do you have nightmares sometimes of this previous violent life, and are you happy?
No, I sleep like a baby.
You sleep like a baby. Good. And you're happy. You're happy today.
I'm really happy. Yeah, my life is beautiful. I live in Ibiza on top of a hill in a forest.
And your relationships are amazing.
Most of my relationships are really beautiful, very healthy, full of growth. Yeah.
Very happy for you, Nick.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, amazing story. There needs to be a movie about you one day.
Thank you.
And you're explaining it very well and sharing super well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.